Thanks, Lars. It's a great pleasure, as always, to be here, and I feel honored to be able to participate in this commemoration. It seems like an important date. As Lars said, I'll talk more widely about hybrid threats, and then Bjorn will hone in on the Swedish case particularly. As Lars said, this grew out of work that I did through CATS for this new European Union Center in Helsinki on hybrid threats. It's already advertised the publication. Pick one up if you want. It's been a fascinating experience. So I started by asking what's new and what's not new. We know that influence operations and propaganda have been around for a very long time. And so what's not new is simultaneous use of many instruments. Propaganda, that's certainly not new. The use of economic levers, we've seen that a lot. What primarily is new in this space is really the fact that now the target is society, not armies. So we've completely moved away from armies on the field to societies or groups versus other societies and groups. And the other tool part of the toolkit is really the cyber and the virtual realm. Those are the new additions to this toolkit of what might otherwise have been called influence operations. It goes under a lot of names. The center in Helsinki is settled on hybrid threats. Started by looking at just a couple of cases, take you through these not in much detail, but first the Crimea and Ukraine, and then the case of Russian intervention in our elections, the US elections. You may have noticed we had elections yesterday, but this was the Russian intervention in the 2016 elections. Start those by looking at cases to get some detail, get some sense for what these operations actually look like. Obviously in Crimea, the goal was to annex Crimea, but to keep Ukraine unstable. Crimea ended up being sort of a conventional military takeover, but it was accompanied by lots of these new tools, by non-military, paramilitary deployments, and a big information campaign. In the end, it amounted mostly to a direct military takeover. Ukraine is, in that sense, much more interesting because it displayed really pretty wide range of instruments on the Russian side, ranging from support for separatist movements to information and cyber warfare to proxies, and then ultimately the use of direct Russian forces. Russia failed to get Ukraine to federalize in ways it wanted, but it did keep it unstable. And said here, Russian leaders are likely to consider that it's a strategic success, but an unsuccessful operation in some senses. But it really did display the wide range of hybrid tools. This is back to Crimea. This was very successful. It did it without hardly any violence and very quickly. I said the Russian campaign in eastern Ukraine was much more interesting and much more complicated. Obviously, they had the benefit of many ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in that part of Ukraine. And Ukraine's government also contributed by some of its language legislation and other things which tended to alienate that Russian and Russian-speaking population. In this case, I think we'd have to say that Russian influence operations, the propaganda campaign, was one of long-standing and was ultimately effective. What was interesting to me particularly was the use of virtual and cyber tools together with kinetic operations. They have an operation, a campaign, maybe using proxies, and then they'd inundate Ukrainian forces with messages saying, your commanders have left the battlefield, it's futile. So it was that combination of targeting soldiers individually with propaganda and information operations, and then the kinetic activity. In general, the focus of this work and of the Helsinki Center is really the non-kinetic piece of hybrid operations. So at one end we have propaganda, at the other end we have kinetic operations, actual military campaigns, and we're mostly interested in the middle, those things short of how countries seek to achieve their objectives, short of actually using direct military force. The other big case discussed in the book is really the Russian intervention in our elections in 2016. Its goal was pretty plain. It was to undermine candidate, and maybe they thought President Clinton, not clear whether at what point the Russians thought that he might actually get Donald Trump elected or help get him elected. But mostly it was also designed to damage American democracy, to make American democracy look like it wasn't good, like it wasn't any better than Russian illiberal democracy. It was three prongs, as you probably recall. One was leaks of emails. So this is cyber espionage, leaks of emails stolen from both the Democratic National Committee, the Democratic National Campaign Committee, and also from John Podesta, Mrs. Clinton's campaign manager. They were hacked, cyber espionage, and then very carefully leaked for maximum strategic purpose. So one set of leaks came right after the Democratic Convention, trying to take attention away from the convention and put the emphasis on some of the emails from the committee and from Podesta. The second time the big release happened was the same day that the news broke of Mr. Trump and his groping comments about women, again trying to divert attention. Second part was overt Russian propaganda. Interesting feature there is the extent to which it was social media aided. Nothing new about propaganda, but what strikes me about the social media piece of it is it's relatively cheap. You think about the Cold War, if you wanted to plant a propaganda story in somebody's newspaper during the Cold War, it was pretty difficult and maybe even a little expensive. Now all you got to do is get some troll to post it and then have a bunch of bots try and get it circulated to trend. Third was hacks into the election infrastructure. Actually got into 21 states. The official conclusion so far, but one about which I'm a little skeptical, is that it didn't have any effect on the election outcome, but at least it was practice for the Russians for maybe this time around or for other elections, including the United States, but also other places as well. Again, the social media piece was botnets and trolls and Russian news outlets, so they'd pick up things from an outlet like RT, get it online, and then have bots, in most cases automatic bots, try and make it trend. As I say, the hacks into the election infrastructure, not clear they were effective, but they're worrisome. And in one state, Indiana, they at least got into the voting rolls. Again, not clear that it had any effect, but as I say, lessons for the future. This is just a picture of the space, the organizations, one each for the main Russian intelligence services, what they were doing. This is the cyber espionage process. What they did, these were the leakers they created. You remember these, DC Leaks, Lucifer 2.0. Those were the outlets they used to get these hacked emails into the public. The point really of both the hacked emails and of the social media aided propaganda campaign was to try and get these things picked up by the mainstream media. So in the social media space, the idea is we could make it trend, then it would be picked up as trending by the establishment media, and that would give it a credibility that it wouldn't otherwise have. The idea is to basically use that as an intermediary to get to establishment media. So false news picked up from, say, RT or someplace like that, then transmitted through social media in the hopes of getting it picked up by mainstream American media. I was struck, this campaign came as a surprise to us in the United States. It probably shouldn't have. This is a pointer to the future, I think. There was a private group, that was looking at jihadi websites in 2014, as early as 2014. And they realized when looking at these websites that many of the posts that were proclaimed to be free Syria posts weren't Syrians, but were Russians. So they were on to the fact that the Russians were doing this kind of thing. What they say is they came to the US government. They didn't come to me, but I wish they had. Anyway, they came to the US government, and what they say is that the government said, we're not interested in Russians, we're interested in jihadis. But this was a kind of early warning of what was happening, and I think it does illustrate the possibilities. What's interesting to me is that because it happened in our elections, then when the French elections happened, they were looking. They were onto it. The Russians were don't know what adjective to apply here, either careless or maybe purposely, I'm not quite sure. They use many of the same techniques, even the same institutions, sometimes the same accounts. And they did same timing, tried to do it on election eve when it was too late for Macron to do anything about it. What's interesting is Macron did issue an 11th hour, 12th hour, I suppose, statement. And this probably illustrates the difference between American and French media. The French media, quality media, picked up the statement and didn't talk much at all about the email and the hacks. It's also interesting because they were on the lookout for this to happen. They actually did mount a kind of a counterattack. When they got these phishing emails, they flooded those sites, those addresses, with junk in the hope that they could distract them, get them off their game. The propaganda campaign was very similar to the one in the US. Indeed, some of the accounts were the same. So it was either careless or, come back to this point later, maybe the Russians sort of wanted us to know that they were able to do this and doing it. I was struck by the relative absence of Russians doing much of anything in the German election campaign. It turns out we now know they did do some things. There were some bots and trolls, mostly trolling in favor of Alternative for Deutschland and anti-Merkel posts. But at the time, it wasn't obvious that they'd done much of anything. And so I think the question was why. I see that they now did more than we realized at the time. But I was asked myself the question why. And maybe it's that they thought they didn't need to do much, that things were going okay for them in Germany. But it may also be that they'd realized that they sort of overplayed their hand, that they were now pretty obvious, and that if they did something major in the German campaign, they would be the news, not the fake news they were seeking to propagate. Here's the toolkit. As I say, much of it's familiar, ranges across the three elements of cyber, which is espionage, attack, and manipulation, funding. Russia's made a lot of use of the Orthodox Church, economic leverage, and then extending to those little green men in the Ukraine, unacknowledged or proxy war. The key is really synchronizing and using simultaneously a set of tools to try and be ambiguous, hope that you may not be detected. As I said, much of the Russian activity in our elections was pretty obvious or pretty easily discovered once we were looking for it. We just weren't looking for it in advance. But it can be unpredictable, it can be variable, and there can be nonlinear effects. I particularly think that's true when you think about combining social media and propaganda with maybe even proxies or the beginning of little green men. Obviously, they are seeking to exploit vulnerabilities. As I always say, it isn't as though Putin and his colleagues created the deep divisions in American society. They just played on them. For other countries in this vicinity, obviously, proximity and access are a source of vulnerability, and playing on existing social and political fault lines, that's what the Russians have done. They've obviously played to both sides, both the left and the right, and have sought to sow divisions. Social media, increasingly, even Europeans, and particularly young Europeans, get most of their news from social media. They're a little better than Americans, who mostly get it only from social media, but that is obviously a fertile field for people who are trying to intervene. And then energy dependence, we've known about that for a long time. That is another source of vulnerability. Talk mostly about the Russians because they've been the most active. I don't think that's going to continue to be the case. I think that because these tools are relatively cheap and may be difficult to identify, to attribute, I think other countries will get in this business. But so far it's been the Russians mostly trying to discredit Western democracy while building their own influence. They, as we know, see all this as defensive. They think that the EU and NATO are pushing up to their borders. They particularly took umbrage at Mrs. Clinton's activities in their 2011 protests. That was one of the sources of animus against her. But I think that, and the goals of the other countries we've seen, China's mostly done it the old-fashioned way with money. And other countries we've seen, like Iran, some of the states in the Gulf, their goals seem to me less clear. They've been more opportunistic. So looking to the future, as I said, I think relatively cheap. So my imagining is that these things will continue. Other people will pick them up because both the social media and the cyber piece are relatively cheap. The technology will change. We've seen that even in the German elections, the Russians were pretty either less active or more subtle, depending on your point of view. They did do some automated bots, but not nearly the same extent as in the American or the French elections. So there will be new tools coming up. The one obvious one is, so far most of this has been words, but increasingly it'll be possible to make very difficult to decipher or to identify false films, false videos. That will be an example with Denzel Washington. And there'll be, I think, increasing use of proxies to avoid attribution. And there'll be, as always, some effort to do salami slicing bit by bit. Hope you can have cumulative influence over time with a series of steps, none of which crosses a red line in the short run. Looked at some of the responses to these hybrid threats across different nations. I won't go through them. But basically, in all cases, the key is really having a whole of government and essentially a whole of society response. Now, as you know, the American government can't walk and chew gum at the same time, so that's really tough for us. But smaller countries may do better at both having a whole of government approach and at reaching out to the private sector. Those people looking at jihadi websites in 2014 are a nice example of the help that we can get from private groups doing their own thing for their own purposes. And in that case, the government didn't have to do much of anything except maybe listen. Here are some of the various ways that particular countries have sought to approach it. Björn, I think, will say more about Sweden when he speaks. This is the EU. At some point, I'm going to figure this slide out, but it's complicated, at least suggests that the EU takes this stuff seriously. Exactly how this all works, I think I should leave to somebody else who knows this better, but I was intrigued by the detailed process. Finally, let me just say a few things about what to do, what lessons we might learn from all this. First for me, I think, is sort of do no harm. We recognize that there are limits on what democratic states can do and should do. The last thing I'd want us to do is emulate Putin out there spreading fake news. I think that's just the last thing we want to do. Every time this conversation comes up, it's observed that the great strength of our democracies is a free press, and the last thing we'd want to do is cast doubt on it or discredit it. Public awareness is critical. Many of those countries, including Sweden, have sought to raise awareness both of the threat and of the purposes behind it. The sequence, I think, from us to the French elections to the German elections is interesting. Awareness went up dramatically once we'd seen them do it in our elections. It's really for me, a new field of public-private cooperation. I think that's true in general in cyber. If you think about cyber in a traditional intelligence paradigm, if there were a hack, then intelligence services would try and attribute that hack, would pass that attribution along to the policy people for action or not action. But that doesn't work anymore, because while the government's trying to do attribution, so are a lot of private companies. That looks like a nuisance in the short run, I think, but in the long run, it seems to me it's a whole new set of partners. So in both the cyber realm and the social media realm, it seems to me taking a whole of society approach is really exactly the right thing to do. Pay a close attention to early warning in a way that we didn't do in the 2016 intervention, and pay attention to the target. This is particularly hard because it's hard, I think, for countries to do vulnerability assessments, because those can pretty easily look political, but it is important to identify those places, those vulnerabilities, like Russian-speaking populations or pockets of people sympathetic to Russia. It's also important, and Björn and I know we'll say more about this, and I think even we did a somewhat better job this time around of trying to harden our election infrastructure. So we don't know yet, but as far as we can tell, the Russians didn't do much in this latest round of elections. We may find out it's more than we think. Facebook said it had taken down 30 accounts identified as Russians seeking to be active in our election. 30 is a pretty small number given the number of Facebook accounts. So far, not clear they were very active, but it is important to pay attention to election. And that's the end. Thank you. Thank you very much.
That work? Excellent. Thank you very much for coming. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Swedish elections, but because of the close proximity to when the elections happened, the primary information we have right now is on what happened online, kind of logical. Also sometimes, and this relates to Greg's former job, when things happen offline, sometimes that knowledge rests within agencies that cannot freely develop or divulge their methods. So a lot of the stuff that has come out as of yet. So we'll walk through a few of the reports that have come out and some of the information. But first, let's talk about what influence campaigns are from a Swedish perspective, because there's a flora of different terms out there. It's basically an actor with an intent employing coordinated actions, overt or covert, or I'd like to say both in certain instances, utilizing a broad number of methods through different kind of channels of tools, categories. It could be cognitive, information influence, physical, diplomatic, economic, and military, when the purpose is primarily to get a psychological effect in the target audience. So you can conduct a military exercise that looks like a regular military exercise, but you actually didn't need to do a military exercise that way. You designed it to get a psychological impact on, for example, another country's target audiences. What we normally end up thinking about when we talk about influence campaigns is the leftmost, information influence. The same way when we talk about psyops, we think of loudspeaker and leaflet drops from airplanes, because that's tangible. We can see it in the media, or we can see it on the internet. But there are a lot of other tools out there that could have a psychological effect on our population, and we need to take that into account. So those kind of tools can then on their own or collectively threaten Swedish sovereignty, Swedish security objectives, but also Swedish interests, which means that it's not only what happens in Sweden that matters. Our relationship with other countries, our participation in different alliances or collaborations matter greatly to our ability to formulate foreign policy and also run our own country domestically. So when does influence constitute a problem? This is from the fundamental research that was the groundwork for the handbook that MSB released for communicators before the election in June, I believe. So it's basically because influence is all around us. We conduct influence on our own, within our own families, I'm sure, to try to launch certain ideas or an extension of the house or things like that. But there are certain manners where influence becomes designed in a manner where the intent probably isn't that great. So deception. When you try to communicate things and try to hide who you are, or try to pretend to be someone you are not, that is normally a signature of someone that maybe doesn't have your best at heart. Certain influence campaigns also exploit vulnerabilities and can then be seen as harmful. Liberal democracies are based on an assumption of goodwill and open dialogue. And certain individuals or certain organizations can turn those greatest assets into a vulnerability by exploiting them. They also break the rules that govern constructive, open, and free debate. Organized trolling, for example, is not a normal content of an open and free debate in a society. Okay, so when you try to investigate and understand influence campaigns, it's kind of important to understand the complexity and the challenges, I think. It's fascinating after the elections reading sometimes, well, nothing happened, so the threat is non-existent, or it was exaggerated by the authorities, or things like that. Similar to marketing campaigns, influence campaigns happen over a long period of time with long-standing strategic aims. It's not, some of the greatest brands in the world, if you want to impart a positive view on an audience to buy your products or view your brand positively, Coca-Cola didn't build their brand through one major marketing campaign. They built their brand over 100 years with many, many small, well thought out actions. And it's kind of similar if you actually want to impart a negative view on another country or try to shift their perception of what goes on in their own country. It's important to note also that when talking about influence, especially in close proximity to it occurring, we are looking for recognizable methods, not a precise estimation of effect. This is based on the best available information and identified patterns of different kinds. It's not like an evaluation of a physics experiment where you pretty rapidly can, measure and present what happened. Also, these campaigns are not seldom designed to be difficult to attribute, find out who's behind them. They tie to existing situations or sentiments in society, which means there's a lot of legitimate communication about an emotional or charged issue in society. And suddenly someone starts injecting disinformation, for example, into that space. It becomes pretty tricky to sort out what comes from where and what's the intent behind it. Digital platforms also have a varying degree of openness, and certain components of influence campaigns involve phone conversation, coordination through messaging apps, and forums, as well as physical meetings. That is difficult to track. This requires a broad range of societal capabilities, as was mentioned earlier, to follow. Also, this means it's a tough challenge for a country if you want to track every single actor out there. That radar image will get a lot of blips pretty quickly. But if you try to start looking at the vulnerabilities and trying to see who is really interested in targeting those, at least then you get a more kind of maybe clear picture of who really doesn't want good things for you or your country. So this is the monstrous slide of our challenges and opportunities. Even more complex because some of the opportunities are also challenges, vice versa. We live in an open society, as was mentioned. Sweden is a small country tremendously dependent on trade and our diplomatic standing with other countries, which means that we have a global connectedness. So a lot of things that happen in other places have an impact on us, and we are rather interested in what is said about us in the world. Challenging events and social stressors, because influence operators are interested in tagging on to things that already are moving in a certain direction, if they're beneficial to them, can be a real challenge. And of course, we know about migration, not only in Sweden, but it's a charged issue around the world. And there are also other issues that are being targeted in terms of that. Information technology, of course. The speed with which information travels today has changed the way we have to evaluate national security and evaluate how communication happens strategically from governments, for example. The Swedish Internet Foundation did an election special report a few months ago on Swedish internet usage and trust. And they did a pretty large survey of, I think, 4,000 respondents. 71% of Swedes obtained political news online. In 2014, the figure was 47%. That's a pretty rapid rise quickly. For first-time voters, the figure was 80%. Swedes still rank TV, paper magazines and friends and family, and online newspapers as the main source of information. And it's rather interesting that social media is not perceived as an important source of information. Different platforms ranging from 19 to 9%. And there are also pretty fairly high awareness of the risks utilizing online sources. And I think this point of view is rather different than if we would have had this conversation 3 years ago with talk about filter bubbles and, people are running amok over the internet. I think we have a little bit more balanced picture now, and there's research ongoing trying to find the nuances of what really matters and what doesn't. 27% of those surveyed had refrained from expressing political opinion online to avoid criticism or hate. Only 40% believe that most information online is reliable, and only 12% of Facebook users think that the most political information that they see in Sweden is reliable on Facebook as a platform. That's a pretty low number. We also have changing conditions for media, not the least because the economics of media when intermediaries such as large social media platforms take a lot of the cut of the profits, makes it difficult to do quality investigative journalism. The amount of data on the internet also makes checking up sources rather difficult sometimes, especially when you need to get your story out there because you're in a competitive marketplace. And we've seen a number of mistakes in the last years where, you know, it's just gone too fast. But that awareness is also rising within media companies. Also, I think we have to recognize that journalists receive a lot more threats these days. As Swedish television reports, I think over 10,000 threats a year for their reporters and journalists. That can also have a very individual impact for those people that have an important job to do. Then we have source criticism, as I mentioned, which is slightly challenging in such an information landscape. A study by the Swedish School Authority in 2015 showed that there were some lacking aspects of how source criticism is handled by senior high school students, for example, in Sweden. And education is important. Societal polarization also makes a debate more difficult. But we do have benefits and advantages as well to counter that kind of analyst disease of always looking at the problems. We have a tremendous increasing awareness during the latter years. We have a stable democracy. We have a rule of law. We have relatively stable social trust in Sweden. A study made at Gothenburg University in 2012 showed, however, that those born 1980 or later, even compared to other groups that were at the same age that were born earlier at their point of that age, have a little lower degree of social trust. And the researchers basically wondered if we slowly are squandering one of the most important pillars under our democratic system. So that is something to keep an eye on, I think, because social trust is tremendously important in a functioning society, a democracy. And also we have a relatively high media credibility, and this was also lifted up in the evaluation that came out a couple of months ago after the elections in France. The importance of having a well-functioning media with credible investigative reporters. So information technology and influence matters. Bots make us kind of question who's actually talking to me and who's amplifying different messages. It's difficult to do a thorough bot analysis on your own when you're sitting on the subway on your way home, maybe. A study from FOI, the Swedish Defence Research Agency, showed that automated bots share URLs of known alternative news sites more frequently than regular accounts. But there's a lot of suspensions going on in the social media space right now. In terms of algorithms, when you and I go out on the internet, we don't see the same things because of our previous searches, because of our different account data and things like that. We're shown different things. So what version of what's on the internet is delivered to you versus to me? That is an interesting aspect to consider. Also, data extraction. If something is free, the data you're giving a site, that's the payment. To get the average citizen to be aware of that, I think, is one of the interesting things, because it ties into micro-marketing and psychographic targeting, the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Now, I think we should be careful to draw widespread conclusions of how dangerous this is. But nevertheless, if you have a lot of data on individuals about their life, about their contacts, you can target information and design messages pretty precisely. So that's also one thing to follow together with AI and other technological advances. And also in this world, when we share information, we lend our credibility to that information. Oxford Institute did a study in 2018 mapping the Swedish general election on Twitter, and they looked at misleading information. And what they found was that political discourse in Sweden is about broad public issues as opposed to specific candidates and parties. But for every 2 links of professional news content shared, Swedish users shared 1 misleading news story. That was the highest proportion of misleading news across all the European elections they had studied. So we do have a problem with information being shared that actually is incorrect or designed to be incorrect. So what did Sweden do to prepare? And some of these correspond with the lessons learned from, for example, France and the United States. One aspect is the importance of strategic communication from several parts of society. In January 2018, Stefan Löfven stated to those thinking about trying to influence the outcome of the elections in our country, stay away. He also pledged to expose without mercy any attempts to interfere in the election. But maybe more important, at all levels of government, Swedish officials have been willing to discuss the threat of foreign influence and talk about it. Also, the Swedish Security Service, the Swedish Police Authority, the Election Authority, and the Swedish Civil Contingencies Agency, MSB, established a national forum dedicated to the security of the election, which included comprehensive threat analysis, election administrator briefings, and a continuous interagency dialogue. And that will probably have benefits far-reaching into the future as well. Party leader briefings were held in the spring of 2017 by the security services, and it was based on a joint threat analysis. Campaign Cybersecurity Handbook was also launched by the security services that focused on cybersecurity for individuals working in sensitive occupations. It was printed in 50,000 copies. MSB has also trained over 10,000 public servants to recognize different influence activities. And maybe not the information itself, but also the sign that I see internationally from us having done such a massive task in a small country such as Sweden does, I think, have an impact and make it easier also for international collaboration to show that we are taking this very seriously and trying to build capability. Influence Operations Handbook was mentioned, was launched in July 2018 for public communicators, because oftentimes they are kind of the first line of defense, both in terms of seeing that something weird is happening on social media, for example, but also being able to design a response. Or if a response needs to be designed elsewhere, they might be, have crucial knowledge about their specific field or geographic region that is important to be credible. Also, the election authority worked continuously to ensure the security of the tech systems that they have. But a benefit in Sweden is, of course, that our system is not dependent on technical systems that can be breached. We have manual aspects of across the whole election process. So that is a benefit in terms of security. Also, dialogue with social media companies is important. And in France, I think 70,000 posts were deleted just a week before the French elections. In Sweden, Swedish authorities had an ability to fast-track deletion requests for fake accounts on Facebook, for example. So that's an advantage, having that ongoing dialogue and preparedness. Then two issues that might not seem, but I think from a signal value perspective, I think reintroducing conscription, and this is brought up in this report at Harvard University, is still an important signal both to the Swedish population and to the world around us. In 2017, now we have 4,000 men and women called up for military service this year. Also, large-scale military exercises, Aurora 17, we had 19,000 men and women from the Swedish Armed Forces and 40 other Swedish agencies. June 2018, the Swedish Armed Forces carried out another large-scale exercise for 20,000 reservists nationwide. And also now we have Trident Juncture, where we participate, NATO's largest military exercise since 2002. So then, what kind of online influence activities could be seen during the elections? This is a study by the London School of Economics and the Institute for Strategic Dialogue in London. They're used to doing digital forensics of different kinds. So they analyzed whether Russian state-supported media and automated accounts were spreading misinformation and disinformation in Sweden. They also looked at non-state actors, including far-right groups in North America and Europe, to determine to what extent these international actors were taking part in online campaigns to tarnish Sweden's reputation. So they found that there was no major state-sponsored influence campaign. And I'm sure you would have heard of it by now if there would have been. But what they did find was the fringe groups and Russian state media do try to actively smear Sweden's reputation internationally. RT and Sputnik provided support to far-right groups in Sweden in their different language editions. And they're more focused on influencing international audiences rather than directly influencing election results. Influence campaigns were discussed in alternative media spaces like 4chan and Discord, which is an area commonly that we've seen in other influence campaigns that are served for fringe groups as a kind of meeting area beforehand and trying to whip up support for certain things and share plans. They observed, however, little or no take-up of those efforts, so that didn't get traction. Amplification tactics, for example, bots were observed, but there was no evidence that they were coordinated or nationally managed. They found bot-like behavior from 55 highly active accounts. Only one of those accounts had been used previously in the US and French elections. It had changed its name, however, but that was the only difference. And no bots that could be tied to Russia were found. The most consistent disinformation campaign was about allegations of election fraud. About 2,000 posts on Twitter that used the term valfusk, election fraud, in the week preceding the election, suggesting that there were coordinated campaign to see the idea of a rigged election before the election was even conducted. And we also see similar tactics used in, for example, the French and the Brexit referendum in the UK. One aspect is interesting, and it's that Sweden, the Swedish far-right, is more isolated and acts more with their own wholly owned kind of media, alternative news channels, than other groups in Europe that do share, to a larger extent, an exchange over platforms. New actors were also found. Different populist media outlets in Poland, for example, spread disinformation about Swedish government and society in Polish, English, and in the Swedish language media. And an Islamist group targeted anti-voting and anti-democracy messages to Swedish Muslim communities. Some Russian narratives then about Sweden in their state media. One is Sweden as a failed state, unable to uphold the law. Sweden receives too many migrants, that's a given. Swedish leaders are guided by political correctness, and this political correctness makes them unable to really serve what the population really needs and wants. Swedes are Russophobes and paranoid about Russia, so we should be discarded about what we say. Swedish society is in moral decay. We're leaving traditional values and going into gay ropa, and feminism is taking over, and all those aspects. Swedish society is undemocratic, and non-mainstream views are silenced. Trying to kind of push that kind of challenges that we actually see in Russia back on the West. Tying back a little bit to what Greg mentioned, information laundering is interesting. This is the story about Smålandsposten, a small local newspaper in the south of Sweden, published on the 11th of May an article with the headline, "Catholic Church were not allowed to ring church bells, could disturb a close-by housing area." And they did an interview with one person that claimed that 10, 15 years ago, the Catholic Church had applied for permission to use their church bells and been denied because it would be a disturbance. This was in relation to a Muslim society that had been allowed to do loudspeaker-sent prayer calls on Fridays between 1300 and 13:03:45. 3 minutes and 45 seconds every Friday. So, of course, the story went viral rapidly, but pretty rapidly also the radio channel P4 started looking into this, and they checked with the local county or the police authority, and they couldn't find any such application from the Catholic Church to ring church bells. But of course then traction was already on. Got picked up by Sputnik, and within, I think actually Voice of Europe, which is a populist site based in the Netherlands, with a rather small group of people, but they do spread a lot of different types of alternative news, had almost identical headline, and also we see a very similar one on InfoWars Europe site. So looking a little bit more closely at that, we can see that Russia sometimes picks up local source material that really is not in the main headlines, and they add interpretations on top of that. And then they push it out through their government-controlled media channels, like Sputnik, that's pretty rapid, or RT. But they know that those channels are not that credible in the West, especially since the last few years of developments. So what do you do then? Well, you have either overt collaborations or you try to seed that information so it gets picked up by alternative media channels. Then you have a little larger proportion of the Western society that actually listens and reads this. And if you're really lucky, you get that trending effect. And maybe BuzzFeed or maybe another major news source that actually has a degree of credibility and a much wider reach picks this story up. Now, for the final audience there that reads that on a regular medium, it's kind of hard to track what actors have been involved in that journey of that information. It's also very difficult to understand the intent or any kind of interpretation that's been layered on top of something that originally was a local news story. So that is a challenge for the media consumer. So why didn't we have a major state-sponsored influence campaign? A few of these things, I'm happy to see that I concur with Greg in terms of some of the other. We have had a pretty rapid increase in awareness and preparedness, especially among key personnel in society. The prior influence campaign outcomes for Russia have been decidedly mixed. And I think they've gotten more attention than they ever wanted in some respects, for example, in France. Also, I think we've seen also that they're not 10 feet tall. Some of the aspects conducted by Fancy Bear APT 28 were rather sloppy in how they did both the data intrusion against the Macron campaign, but also some of the fabricated stories they seeded into those 9 gigabytes that were not well designed for a French audience. We have a comparatively resilient election system in Sweden, which helps. It is not that easy to influence elections themselves. Of course, as the security services mentioned a number of months ago, that points to the alternative then is trying to aim at the perception of how the election was conducted, for example. Was it, a fair and just election? And sometimes thinking about this long-term arc of strategic aims and utilizing influence from capable actors, you step back to observe and evaluate. Sometimes maybe to lick your wounds, but sometimes to redirect, to regroup, the same way you utilize other means in society. It's not just a constant. Also, prioritizing between areas of interest. Large actors have a number of areas of interest. If we look at Russia, we can see Ukraine, Eastern Europe, China, US, Europe. There's a lot of space to cover there. And even though a lot of resources are being applied to this area, maybe you need to prioritize to where you feel right now in this time frame, we can get a lot of gains towards this part of the world. So that could also determine where you spend your resources. And finally then, elections are a very important democratic event, and they're kind of easy to focus on from an influence perspective because it's kind of clear, delineated in time. But in the perspective of capable states or groups utilizing influence of different kinds, it's one link, as I mentioned, in a long change of potential opportunities. We can also be sure that actors such as Russia and fringe movements with different motivations are not the only actors that are picking up on the potential use of these tools and how cheap they are and the low barriers of entry of certain technological solutions that enable you to spread information globally. And bearing in mind the developments of the last few years, I think we will have to keep our eyes on this challenge for a very long time. Thank you very much.